On the evening of June 9th, 1912, the town of Villisca, Iowa, went to sleep believing it was safe. It was a small town, fewer than 2,000 people, the kind of place where doors were rarely locked. Neighbors knew one another by name, and nothing truly bad was supposed to happen. Villisca existed in a rhythm of routine. Church on Sunday, chores at dawn, quiet streets after dark. That night was no different, at least not on the surface. The house on 2nd Street. At 508 East 2nd Street, the Moore family home sat quietly beneath the Iowa sky. It was a modest, wood-frame house, not isolated, not hidden, just another home in a row of homes, close enough that sounds could travel, close enough that someone passing by would not seem suspicious. Inside lived Josiah Moore, his wife Sarah, and their 4 children. They were known in town, respected, ordinary. That ordinary quality is important, because nothing about this case begins with chaos. It begins with normal life continuing as expected. A Sunday evening. That Sunday, the Moore children attended a church program. Something common, something routine. 2 friends from the neighborhood accompanied them afterward. Sleepovers were unremarkable in Villisca. Children often stayed the night with little planning. By late evening, the house settled into quiet. Lights went out. Doors were closed. The town slowed. No alarms were raised. No disturbances were reported. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling part. What wasn't heard, there were no reports of screams. No neighbors described loud noises. No one recalled anything unusual in the hours that followed. This absence of sound would later haunt investigators, because what occurred inside the house did not announce itself. It unfolded silently. Morning never came. The next day, June 10th, began like any other, except the Moore family did not appear. Children did not come outside. Josiah did not leave for work. The house remained still. At first, this wasn't alarming. People slept in. Schedules changed. But as the morning stretched on, concern grew. The first knock. A neighbor approached the house. No answer. They tried again. Still nothing. Eventually, someone went inside. What they encountered was not chaos, but something far worse. Stillness. A stillness that did not belong. A house that felt wrong. Those who entered later described the same sensation. The house felt heavy. Windows were covered, curtains drawn, light blocked. It was as if the home had been intentionally sealed off from the morning. Rooms were undisturbed in the way that only something deliberate can create. Not ransacked, not hurried, not chaotic, deliberate. The discovery authorities were contacted. The house was secured. What was found inside would change Villisca forever. But even then, the true horror was not immediately obvious, because the scene did not look like panic. It looked like order imposed after something unspeakable. The strange details. As investigators moved through the house, patterns began to emerge. Windows were covered from the inside. Lamps had been repositioned. Objects were moved carefully, not violently. Nothing appeared stolen. Nothing appeared broken in haste. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was not an accident. This was not someone acting without time. The sense of presence. Even early on, one idea surfaced repeatedly. Whoever had been in the house did not rush. They did not flee immediately. They took time. That realization unsettled everyone involved. The town reacts. Word spread quickly. Villisca did not have the luxury of anonymity. Everyone knew the Moore family. Everyone knew where the house was. Fear spread faster than facts. Parents brought children inside. Doors that had never been locked suddenly were. People stood in groups, whispering. because if this could happen here, it could happen anywhere. The house becomes a symbol. Within hours, the Moore home stopped being just a building. It became something else, a reminder, a warning, a place people avoided walking past, even in daylight. Early mistakes. The year was 1912. Forensic science was limited. Crime scene protocol was primitive by modern standards. People entered the house. Officials, neighbors, even the curious. Evidence was unknowingly disturbed. Paths were crossed. Footprints overlapped. The house absorbed confusion as easily as it had absorbed silence. What no one could explain. Despite the chaos that followed discovery, one thing remained consistent. No one could explain how such an event could occur without anyone noticing, without anyone hearing, without anyone interrupting. The idea that someone could move through the house, room by room, without resistance or noise, unsettled even seasoned investigators. The question that formed immediately before suspects, before theories, before accusations. There was one question that hovered over everything. How did no one wake up? That question would never be answered. The house, at night. In the days that followed, people began to talk, not about evidence, but about feelings. Neighbors described walking past the house at night and feeling watched. Others claimed the house felt different after dark, heavier, colder, as if something lingered. The start of a pattern. Investigators soon realized something else. The Villisca event did not exist in isolation. There were other cases, other towns, other homes, other families, separated by distance, but linked by disturbing similarities. The realization came slowly, and when it did, it changed everything. Not just a local horror. What had happened in Villisca was not unique. It was part of something larger, something moving, something repeating. And Villisca was only one stop. A town that would never be the same for Villisca. Time split in two. Before June 9th, 1912, and after. Children no longer slept easily. Parents no longer trusted silence. The night was no longer neutral. It had become a threat. The house remains. The Moore house did not disappear. It stayed, empty, watching. A structure that held memory whether anyone wanted it to or not. Even years later, people would cross the street to avoid it. Not because of superstition, but because of instinct. What this story is really about, this is not a story about shock. It is a story about vulnerability, about how safety is often an illusion, about how the most terrifying events do not announce themselves. They arrive quietly, they move slowly, and they leave silence behind. The night Villisca lost its innocence, June 9th, 1912, ended like any other night, but Villisca never woke up the same. Because once something like this happens, the idea of home changes forever. By the time officials began their formal work inside the Moore house, something crucial had already been lost. Control. The scene had been entered too many times. Curious neighbors, local officials, well-meaning townspeople. In 1912, the idea of preserving a location exactly as it was found was still new. And Villisca paid the price for that ignorance. The house had absorbed footsteps, fingerprints, and whispered conversations before anyone fully understood what they were looking at. And yet, even through the confusion, certain details stood out. Details that didn't fade. Room by room, investigators moved slowly through the house. Not because of procedure, but because the atmosphere demanded it. There was an unnatural stillness, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Doors were closed in a deliberate way. Furniture stood where it belonged. Nothing suggested panic or struggle. This was not disorder. This was intentional quiet. The covered windows. One of the first things noted was the way the windows had been handled. Curtains were drawn, shades were pulled. In some cases, cloth had been used to block out light entirely. This had been done from the inside. Someone had taken the time to darken the house, not just for concealment, but for control. It suggested planning. It suggested patience. It suggested someone who did not fear being interrupted. Light sources moved. Oil lamps inside the home had been repositioned. Not knocked over, not broken, moved, placed carefully, as if someone needed light in specific areas at specific moments. This was not random behavior. It indicated awareness of the space, familiarity, or at least careful observation. Nothing taken. One of the most confusing aspects of the case was the absence of theft. Money remained. Personal items were untouched. Valuables were left behind. There was no sign of financial motive. No obvious reason that made sense. This was not about gain. Whatever had happened here, it was driven by something else entirely. The lack of noise. As investigators tried to reconstruct the timeline, one fact overshadowed everything. No one heard anything. Not neighbors, not passers-by, not even those sleeping close by. The house was surrounded by other homes. Sound should have carried, but it didn't. Or if it did, no one understood it for what it was. This raised troubling questions. Had everyone been asleep? Or had the event unfolded in a way that minimized sound? The answers were unreachable. A slow realization. As hours passed, officers began to understand something unsettling. Whoever had been responsible was not acting in haste. They had moved from room to room. They had taken time. They had not panicked. And perhaps most disturbing of all, they had remained in the house longer than necessary. That idea changed how investigators viewed everything. The attic attention eventually turned upward, to the attic, a space often overlooked, hidden, quiet, accessible. Evidence suggested that someone may have spent time there, waiting, watching, listening. The thought that someone could remain above a sleeping household, unseen, unheard, deeply unsettled the investigators, because it meant this event may not have begun when people were asleep. It may have begun long before. No forced entry doors were intact. Locks were not broken. Windows showed no signs of struggle. This suggested one of two possibilities. Either the person responsible was let inside, or they were already there. Neither option brought comfort. The town's trust. Villisca was built on familiarity. People trusted one another. Doors were left unlocked. Strangers were noticed, but not feared. That trust now worked against the investigation, because anyone could have walked into the house without raising suspicion. Anyone. Early suspects emerge. With little physical evidence to guide them, investigators turn to people, neighbors, acquaintances, anyone who seemed unusual. Suspicion spread quickly, sometimes based on behavior, sometimes based on rumor, sometimes based on nothing more than intuition. And intuition, in a frightened town, is dangerous. One name spoken quietly. Among the early persons of interest was a traveling individual who passed through the region, someone with no permanent ties, someone who could arrive and leave unnoticed. At the time, this idea made sense, but evidence was thin, and accusations without proof only deepened the confusion. Investigation under pressure. The case attracted attention far beyond Villisca. Newspapers arrived. Officials from outside jurisdictions offered input. Each brought theories. Each brought opinions. But coordination was lacking. Everyone worked, but not together. Information fragmented. Leads overlapped. Critical moments slipped away. A house filled with questions. As days passed, the house revealed less and less. No clear sequence, no definitive timeline, no unifying explanation. Each room raised questions instead of answering them. And the more investigators searched, the more the house seemed to resist understanding. The feeling that something was missed. Even early on, some officials admitted privately that mistakes had been made. Too many people inside. Too little control. Too much noise after the fact. The truth, whatever it was, had been diluted, scattered, lost among good intentions and fear. The public loses faith. As days turned into weeks with no resolution, confidence faded. People wanted answers. Instead, they got speculation. Theories contradicted each other. Suspects were named and dismissed. Hope thinned. Fear thickened. The house becomes silent again. Eventually, official activity slowed. The house was closed. Its rooms left empty. But the silence now felt different. No longer peaceful. It was weighted with unresolved questions. The kind that don't fade. They linger. A case that began to rot without new leads. The investigation stalled. Momentum was lost. The trail went cold. Not because it had ended, but because it had never been clearly defined to begin with. And that failure would shape everything that followed. What investigators didn't realize yet. They believed they were chasing a single event, but they weren't. They were standing at the center of something broader, something that extended beyond Villisca, beyond Iowa, beyond one house. That realization had not arrived yet, but it was coming. The fear that settled in. In Villisca, nights became longer. Lights stayed on. Children slept closer to parents. The quiet was no longer comforting. It was suspicious, because silence had proven it could hide anything. When evidence refuses to speak, suspicion does. And in Villisca, suspicion spread faster than truth. By late 1912, the investigation had shifted away from the house itself and toward the people surrounding it. With no definitive trail to follow, investigators began doing what they could, narrowing their focus not by proof, but by possibility. This was where the case began to fracture. The problem with familiar faces. In a town as small as Villisca, everyone knew everyone. That closeness became a liability. Investigators interviewed neighbors repeatedly, often asking the same questions in different ways, hoping for inconsistencies, a raised voice, a nervous pause, anything that felt off. But familiarity breeds assumptions. If someone behaved differently than usual, it became suspicious. If someone behaved too normally, that also became suspicious. There was no winning formula. The rumor engine. As official progress slowed, rumors accelerated. Stories circulated in shops, churches, and homes. Someone had seen a light. Someone heard something, but dismissed it. Someone noticed a stranger weeks earlier. None of it could be verified. But each story added pressure. And pressure demands resolution, even if the resolution is wrong. The first major person of interest, one of the earliest individuals questioned extensively, was a man connected socially to the family. He knew the house. He knew the layout. He knew the routines. On paper, this made sense. But when examined closely, the case against him unraveled. Timelines didn't align. Witness accounts contradicted one another. No physical evidence supported the theory. Still, suspicion lingered. Because once a name enters public consciousness, it never fully leaves. The danger of desperation. As weeks turned into months, investigators grew desperate. They needed answers, not just for the town, but for themselves. Careers were now tied to this case. Reputations were on the line, and desperation does not always seek truth. Sometimes it seeks closure. A confession that shook everything. In 1917, 5 years after the event, the case took a dramatic turn. A man named William Mansfield was arrested in connection with a similar event in Illinois. Under questioning, Mansfield allegedly admitted involvement in Villisca. The confession spread like wildfire. At last, a breakthrough, or so it seemed. The problem with the confession: Mansfield's statements were inconsistent. Details changed. Timelines shifted. Key facts didn't match the Villisca scene. Even more troubling, parts of his account contained errors that someone familiar with the case wouldn't make. Investigators attempted to reconcile the gaps. They couldn't, and Mansfield later recanted. Just like that, the strongest lead dissolved. The public reacts. The community was devastated. Hope had risen and crashed. People began questioning the competence of officials. Newspapers criticized law enforcement openly. Trust eroded, and when trust disappears, fear rushes in to fill the void. Another name enters the story. Soon after, attention turned to Reverend George Kelly. Kelly was a traveling minister who had been in Villisca around the time of the incident. He was quiet, socially awkward, deeply religious, and, crucially, he stood out. In frightened communities, standing out is dangerous. Interrogation without protection. Kelly was detained and questioned extensively, for hours, then days. He was isolated, denied rest, confronted repeatedly. Eventually, he confessed. The town exhaled. Finally, a resolution. But the details didn't hold. Kelly's confession was riddled with problems. He couldn't accurately describe the house. He misunderstood key aspects of the scene. He contradicted himself repeatedly. Medical professionals later testified that Kelly was highly suggestible. He wanted to please authority figures. He wanted the questioning to stop, and that made his confession unreliable. A trial that solved nothing. Kelly was brought to trial. The courtroom was packed. The atmosphere was electric. But when evidence was presented, it fell apart. No physical proof. No consistent testimony. No definitive link. The jury acquitted him. And just like that, Villisca was back where it started. The aftermath of failure. By now, the investigation was wounded beyond repair. Multiple false starts, public embarrassment, contradictory theories. Every new suspect weakened confidence rather than restored it. The case had become a cautionary tale, not of mystery, but of missteps. The question no one could answer. Why Villisca? There was no clear motive, no personal disputes that explained everything, no financial reason, no obvious trigger. The lack of motive haunted investigators more than anything else, because without motive, prediction becomes impossible. Similar events elsewhere. Quietly, some officials began noticing unsettling parallels, events in other states, similar patterns, comparable settings. Nothing concrete enough to pursue publicly, but enough to disturb those paying attention. The possibility emerged that Villisca was not isolated. That idea was terrifying. Why the case couldn't move forward? Evidence contamination, poor record keeping, conflicting statements. Too many early errors had poisoned the well. By the time modern investigative thinking emerged, it was too late. The past could not be reconstructed, only guessed at. The town's slow withdrawal. Eventually, Villisca stopped expecting answers. Life continued, but cautiously. The house stood, empty, watching, a physical reminder of uncertainty. and uncertainty is heavier than truth. A case that turned inward instead of pointing outward at a clear culprit, the case collapsed inward, consuming trust, confidence, and peace. People stopped asking who did this. They began asking something worse. Could it happen again? What still lingered? Despite everything, one belief remained. Someone knew something. Someone had seen something. But fear, time, and silence had buried it deep. By the time official investigations slowed to a crawl, the Villisca case had already slipped beyond the control of law enforcement. It no longer belonged solely to the courts. It belonged to the public imagination. And once a case reaches that stage, it never truly ends. When a local case became a national whisper, in the years following the failed trials, newspapers across the United States continued to revisit Villisca, not because there was new evidence, but because there was unfinished business. Articles framed the case not as a solved crime, but as a warning, an example of how certainty can vanish overnight. Villisca became shorthand for unresolved fear. Mentioning the name alone was enough to conjure unease, patterns that made people uncomfortable. As journalists and amateur researchers revisited archives, something unsettling emerged. Villisca wasn't alone. Across the Midwest and parts of the South, earlier incidents shared disturbing similarities. Quiet towns, ordinary households, nighttime events, no clear motive, no clear suspect. Each case, taken alone, could be dismissed. Together, they formed a pattern people didn't want to acknowledge. Officials never confirmed a connection, but they also never disproved it. And in mysteries, silence speaks loudly. The traveling theory. One idea gained traction decades later. The possibility of a single individual moving between towns. Someone who understood how to blend in. Someone who exploited routine. Someone who vanished before questions could form. This theory terrified people, not because it was proven, but because it was plausible. In an era before centralized databases and instant communication, movement left little trace, especially if no one was looking for patterns yet. Why this theory stayed unofficial? Law enforcement avoided endorsing the idea publicly. Doing so would raise questions they couldn't answer. Why weren't warnings issued? Why weren't communities alerted? Why weren't connections pursued earlier? Acknowledging a broader threat would also mean acknowledging failure. So the theory lived in footnotes, and footnotes are where uncomfortable truths often hide. The house remained. While theories traveled, the house stayed still. It stood quietly on its street, unchanged, unmoving. New families moved in. They left. Some stayed briefly. Some refused to stay overnight. Stories followed them out. Strange sounds, unsettling dreams, a feeling of being watched. None of it could be verified, but all of it was consistent. When a place absorbs a story, over time, the house stopped being just a structure. It became a symbol, not of violence, but of uncertainty. Visitors described the same sensation, a heaviness. Not fear exactly, more like pressure, as if the space remembered something even if people couldn't. The rise of paranormal interest. By the late 20th century, the house entered a new chapter. Researchers, writers, and investigators interested in unexplained phenomena began paying attention. Not because of what happened, but because of what lingered. The lack of resolution created a vacuum, and where answers are missing, interpretation rushes in. Skepticism versus experience. Skeptics dismissed claims immediately. Old houses make noise. Human minds fill gaps. Expectation shapes perception. All reasonable explanations. But even skeptics admitted something unusual. Reports came from people who didn't know the full history, who weren't seeking attention, who described experiences in similar language. That consistency made dismissal harder. Why the house became a magnet? People aren't drawn to fear. They're drawn to unfinished stories. The Villisca House represents a question with no punctuation, no period, no conclusion, just an open sentence. And humans hate open sentences. The transformation into a destination. Eventually, the house became accessible to visitors. Some came for history, some for curiosity, some for answers, and some came believing the house would speak. Whether it did is subjective, but nearly everyone left changed, quieter, more thoughtful, less certain. The power of place. Psychologists refer to something called place memory. The idea that locations associated with intense events can influence emotional response long after. You don't need belief in anything supernatural to feel it. Standing where something unresolved occurred alters perception. Your mind fills the silence, and silence is loud. Why the case never fades? Most historical cases fade because they end. This one doesn't. No definitive explanation, no accepted narrative, no resolution to agree on. Each generation reinterprets it through its own fears. Early 1900s. Danger from outsiders, mid-century. Failure of institutions, modern era. Patterns, psychology, and unseen forces. The case evolves because it must. The cost of not knowing. For Villisca, the unanswered questions carried a price. The town's name became inseparable from the event. Tourism came, but so did stigma. Residents learned to live with dual identities, a normal community and a symbol of mystery, neither fully erasable. When time doesn't heal, time usually softens memory. But in Villisca, time sharpened it. The longer the silence stretched, the heavier it became. Every anniversary reopened the question. Every article revived speculation, and speculation never sleeps. What modern investigators face today, revisiting the case means navigating. Lost evidence, contradictory records, second-hand accounts, biased reporting. Modern tools can't fix missing pasts. They can only reinterpret fragments, and fragments don't always fit. The house is a mirror. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is this. The house reflects whoever enters it. Skeptics leave thinking about psychology. Believers leave thinking about forces unseen. Historians leave thinking about institutional failure. The house offers no answers, only reflections. A story that demands a meaning. People still ask, why that family? Why that town? Why that night? But perhaps the case endures because it refuses to offer meaning. It simply exists, unfinished. There are cases that fade with time, and then there are cases that deepen. Villisca belongs to the second category, a story that grows heavier the longer it remains unresolved, because what frightens people most is not what they understand, but what refuses to be understood. The finality that never came. When investigations officially slowed, there was no announcement, no declaration of closure, no final report that tied everything together. The case simply stopped moving. Files were archived, witnesses aged, memories softened and warped, and yet the core question remained untouched. Who was responsible, and why did they vanish so completely? The problem with every theory. Over the decades, countless explanations have been proposed, some logical, some imaginative, some deeply unsettling, but all of them share one fatal flaw. None can answer every question. Each theory explains something, but never everything, and that gap is where unease lives. The lone individual theory. One of the most enduring ideas is that the event was carried out by a single person acting alone. Someone patient, someone methodical, someone capable of remaining unseen. Supporters of this theory point to The quiet execution, the lack of forced entry, the apparent familiarity with the home. But critics ask the same question every time. How does one person leave nothing behind? No reliable sightings, no traceable trail, no later confession. In an era where even small mistakes echoed loudly, this absence feels almost impossible. Almost. The insider theory. Another possibility suggests involvement from someone known to the household. A person who understood routines. A person who wouldn't raise suspicion. A person who could approach unnoticed. This theory explains access, but it introduces a new mystery. Why was there never a clear motive? No financial incentive, no confirmed dispute, no obvious trigger. People don't act without reason, unless the reason is something they never share. The pattern theory returns. As discussed earlier, some researchers believe Villisca was part of a larger, unacknowledged pattern. That similar incidents occurred before, that others may have occurred after, that the truth lies not in isolation, but repetition. This idea terrifies because it suggests something worse than a single mystery. It suggests a system failure, a blind spot, a danger no one recognized until it was too late. Why officials never embraced it. Endorsing a broader pattern would mean accepting that warning signs were missed, that prevention was possible, that responsibility didn't stop at one town. So the theory remains unofficial, persistent, unprovable, uncomfortable. The role of silence. Silence isn't empty, it's full of implication. In Villisca, silence became the loudest element of all. Witnesses who changed their stories, documents that disappeared, leads that were never followed publicly. Each absence added weight, not evidence, but suspicion. When history runs out of road, modern investigators face an impossible task. Evidence can't be recreated. Witnesses can't be re-questioned accurately. Context can't be fully restored. What remains is interpretation. And interpretation is shaped by fear, culture, and expectation. The house. As a final witness. Of all elements in this case, only one remains unchanged. The house. It outlived the people. It outlasted the investigation. It absorbed every version of the story. And it still stands. Not accusing, not forgiving, just present. Why people still visit. Visitors often say they aren't searching for proof. They're searching for understanding, for a feeling, for confirmation that something real happened here, something unresolved. Some leave convinced nothing unusual exists. Some leave shaken. Both reactions are valid because the house doesn't offer answers. It offers atmosphere. Psychology of unfinished stories. Human brains crave endings. We are uncomfortable with ambiguity. An unresolved case activates the same mental stress as an unanswered question. Your mind loops, replays, speculates. Villisca triggers that loop endlessly because no interpretation sticks. The legend versus the reality over time. The case developed two identities, the historical event and the legend. The legend exaggerates. The reality resists clarity. The tension between them keeps the story alive. If it were fully legend, it would feel distant. If it were fully explained, it would fade. Instead, it exists between worlds. What makes Villisca different? Many historical mysteries exist. Few feel personal. Villisca feels intimate because it occurred in a place meant for safety, a home, a town defined by trust. That contrast, normality disrupted without explanation, is what lingers. Modern questions without modern answers. Today, people ask different questions than they did in 1912. What does this say about community perception? About trust? About institutional blind spots? the case becomes less about who and more about how something like this could happen unnoticed. The unsettling possibility, perhaps the most disturbing idea, is this: what if the truth was simple but lost, not hidden, not protected, just misplaced by time, chaos, and human error? A truth that no longer exists in recoverable form. That possibility offers no comfort. Why the case will never close. Closure requires consensus. Villisca has none. Every theory fractures. Every explanation leaves residue. Every attempt to conclude opens new questions. And so the story remains open, not by choice, but by necessity. What Villisca really represents. At its core, Villisca is not about one night. It's about uncertainty, about how easily order can fracture, about how silence can replace answers, and about how some questions refuse to be buried. The Villisca axe murders are not remembered because of what is known. They are remembered because of what isn't, because the truth never stepped forward, because time did not heal, because the house still stands, and because some stories don't end, they wait.